America's government rests on 5 simple principles found in the Declaration of Independence. What inspired our founding fathers to create this distinct form of government? Why did they choose these particular principles as the basis of our nation? And why is it important for Americans to preserve them today? Join historian David Barton as he traces America's history back to the source in Building on the American Heritage. Uncover the forgotten stories, examine the nation's founding documents, and discover firsthand our founding fathers' original intent. Explore the morals and values America was built on centuries ago. Learn the truth of America's past so you can shape America's future. This is Building on the American Heritage.
All right, David, I've been excited about this show because we're really getting to the heart of the matter. We've been the most successful nation in history. What is the cause for the effect of America's success?
When you look at what we've been able to do, and we have 4% of the world's population and 32% of the world's gross domestic product, and it's not because we have more natural resources. I mean, Africa, other continents have a lot more resources than we do.
Yeah.
But we've been blessed to be able to take the resources we have and produce wealth at an unbelievable rate, produce stability. We're the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the world, and it's not an accident. Because if it is, nobody else has stumbled on the cause. I mean, look at every other nation, 192 nations at the UN. They don't have the stability, the prosperity. So where'd it come from? That's where you have to go back and look at the foundations. So when you look at it, in our case, it is the Declaration of Independence. And in that document, you start with 104 words up top that give the 5 fundamental principles on which American government operates.
So this is the formula that produces the result.
That's it. Now that you get those 5 principles, they then give you 27 grievances saying, now here's the 5 principles, and here's 27 examples of where Great Britain has violated these principles, and we can't stay a nation if we can't do these 5 things. And then they close at the end with a very clear declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. We mutually pledged each other our lives, fortune, sacred honor, and that's where their integrity came out. Because you look at the story of these guys, and so many of them did lose their lives and fortune, sacred honor to keep their word, but it goes back to they were wanting to uphold those 5 principles. So you look at the 5 principles in 104 words, they say, number 1, we in government acknowledge that there's a creator. Now that's not a personal declaration, that's not something private. We say, government says in the document, we hold these truths to be self-evident. These truths are so obvious, anybody gets them. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So you start with the fact there is a creator. We are a created being. That is an acknowledgement of government. The second point is the creator gives certain inalienable rights to every man. Among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. 11 years later, when they did the Constitution, they did the Bill of Rights, they came back and said, you know, we told you there were 3 among others, so we're going to give you a bunch of others now. Second point is God Himself gives certain rights to every individual, regardless of race or station or position or anything else. These are God-given rights, not government-given rights. The third point says that government exists to protect these rights. The whole purpose we have government is government makes sure that I have the right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. Nobody can stop me from acknowledging. Now, they do it all the time now. You know, they've kind of reversed that.
Turn it on its head.
They've turned it on its head, but the purpose of government was to make sure I had the right to defend myself, to make sure I had the right to enjoy my property, to make sure I had a right to life. And by the way, you go all the way back to Thomas Jefferson in the 1700s, he's passing anti-abortion laws in the legislature of Virginia. You look in Pennsylvania, James Wilson, the same thing, founding father. We had anti-abortion laws in every state in America.
And wait, David, I always thought abortion was a 40, 50-year issue.
Yeah,
You're saying
not.
Even 200 years
we
ago,
have
that's huge.
all these old books we have a book on abortion in America from 1808. It's an 1808 book on abortion in America. And by the way, also the issue of homosexuals in the military, that's been something in the last few years. That's not a new issue. George Washington dealt with homosexuals in the military back in March of 1778. That's what established the original policy the Pentagon held for so many years until they started playing with it the last few years.
So there really is nothing
there's
new
nothing
under
under the sun.
But the right to life then, not only are you saying is that right to life include don't allow abortion because we're going to protect life, but it's saying that government's the one supposed to do it. Supposed to protect
right.
the purpose of government.
That's the third fundamental principle of government is number 1, there's a God. Number two, God gives certain rights. Number three, government exists to protect those rights, including the right to life, etc., etc. The fourth principle was that there is a moral law. And the Declaration says there are the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. That actually is a quote directly out of this book. This is a book from 1766. This is called Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law. This is the law book that was used in America. Matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson said that American lawyers used Blackstone like Muslims used the Quran. I mean, this was kind of like the Bible for lawyers. And that phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God, comes out of Volume 1. And what Blackstone points out is there is a Creator. The Creator made us, and the Creator placed creation around us, and creation tells us what His will is. Now, this is the same thing that Paul tells us in Romans chapter 1, where he says that everything that can be known about God, including the intricacies of the Godhead, have been revealed through what He has created, so that even the heathen are without excuse. That's what Paul says. Now, what happened, and as Blackstone points out, Judge Blackstone points out that, well, when man sinned, a lot of stuff became really cloudy. He had real clear vision. He understood exactly what God wanted. And when we sin has clouded our reason and understanding. So God, in His compassion to us, says, okay, let me just write it down for you in black and white. Let me put it in the Bible so that you get it. These are the laws of nature's God. The God who created nature gave us these laws right here. So we have the laws of nature, we have the laws of nature's God. Those two never violate each other.
See, that's a very different view of the laws of nature than, I'm going to put you up against my law school professors now, because we were always told laws of nature is kind of like this new age thing. It's more of what feels
whatever
good,
you
whatever
want it to
everybody
be.
comes
Exactly.
up with at the time. But laws of nature to the founding fathers and in our founding documents means we're going back to what God put
You
in
take
place.
the guys who did the documents. Rufus King, signer of the Constitution, said the laws of nature are the laws of God. Alexander Hamilton said the laws of nature are the laws of God, signer of the Constitution. You have to operate under those laws. So that's the fourth point of government, is there is a moral law. The fifth point of government is below the moral law, we do things with the consent of the governed. And that's where George Washington and Thomas Jefferson says that the fundamental principle of the Constitution is the will of the majority prevails. That's the consent of the governed. Yeah. But that's only below the level of moral law.
That doesn't mean whatever everybody wants to do today will do. You
That's
still
a
have to
democracy.
be under that moral
See,
law.
a democracy is everybody chooses what they want to do. We're not a democracy. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution prohibits America from becoming a democracy. Israel was set up as a republic, not a democracy. There are democracies in the Bible. Israel never was one. God didn't allow His people to be a democracy. The Founding Fathers hated democracy. 7 forms of government in the world at that time. They hated democracy. They established a republic. So we pledge allegiance to the Republic of the United States, not the democracy of the United States, which means there are certain things on which you do not vote. It doesn't matter what the will of the people is on certain things, and that's the moral law. And Blackstone gives a good example. He says, with the issue of murder, he said, God has said everything in His Word that needs to be said about murder. He said, therefore, legislatures can do nothing different than what God has already said to do. He said, now, when it comes to importing or exporting wool, God doesn't tell us how to do that, so we can use the consent of the governed. We go over to the legislature and say here, and see, this is also biblical as well. When you look in the Bible, there are 4 types of law. The first type of law in the Bible is what we call ceremonial law. That's the means by which you become righteous. So you do a sacrifice, you do a goat, a lamb. That law is passed away between the Old Testament and New Testament. The second thing that they cover in the Scriptures is called the judicial law. Judicial law is the penalty that's applied to a crime. For example, back in the Old Testament, you have adulterers stoned. You get to the New Testament, they bring the woman in adultery to Jesus, doesn't stone her, but He does say, hey, don't do this anymore. Now, what He said is adultery is wrong, but the penalty's changed. I mean, we're from Texas. We used to hang horse thieves. Well, we don't hang horse thieves anymore. It's still wrong to steal horses, but the penalty has changed. So the judicial law changes across time. The 10 Commandments say don't kill, but they don't give a penalty. They say don't steal, but there's no penalty. Nothing in the 10 Commandments gives a penalty, because the 10 Commandments are the moral law. They tell you what's right, they tell you what's wrong. Now, the judicial law may change, and the fourth law is called the social compact, and that's the consent of the majority. Social compact says, hey, if it's not covered in the Scriptures, we can decide what we want to do. And in the great example is the speed limits. It doesn't violate the laws of God. It's parking meters and parking zones. That's consent of the government.
We as a society
We as a society say, hey, we think 55 or 70 or 25 or whatever. We think that's what we want to do. It doesn't violate the law of God. It's not a violation of the moral law. We get the consent. So that is the 5 fundamental principles on which American government has operated from the beginning. There is a Creator. The Creator gives rights. Government exists to protect the rights the Creator gave to every individual. There is a moral law under which we govern ourselves, given by God. And number 5, below the moral law, we'll use the consent of the governed. Those 5 ideas were so radical, even the British couldn't handle them. They looked at the first and they said, would you look at this? They said, our American cousins say that all men are created equal. That is nonsense. You're created by classes, you're created by races. There's not equality. The notion of individual equality, they thought that was crazy. And then they went on and said, and would you look at this? Our American cousins say that they're endowed by their Creator with rights. We know that's nonsense. It's Parliament that gives us our rights. It's the King that gives. Exactly. If the Parliament and King can give them to you, they can take them away from you.
Right.
If God gave them to you, you can say, government, get out of here. These belong to God. You can't mess with them.
I got to tell you, David, this really challenges what some people would say is the American idea of freedom, because they would argue that it's everybody do whatever they want, but that's not
That's the
the
American
formula.
idea of anarchy.
Yeah.
See, that is Judges, where it says, in that day Israel had no authority. Every man did that which was right in their own eyes.
Yeah.
That is anarchy. That's a terrible way to live. We're told over in the New Testament that it's the perfect law of liberty. Interesting that liberty is based on the law. That's why we use the rule of law, not the absence of law. The rule of law is what gives you liberty and stability, but the laws have to be based on God, not man.
It doesn't mean do whatever you want. It means do
No.
whatever you want within these rules, within these parameters.
When you follow these rules, you have liberty in society. If you'll follow it, 10 Commandments, great example. From a civil, secular standpoint, I don't care if my neighbor's an atheist. And as a Christian, I do. But from a civil, secular standpoint, if my neighbor will follow the 10 Commandments, if he will not kill me, not take my wife, and not steal my property, he'll be a really good neighbor.
Yeah.
If he'll live by those moral laws that come from God, not anything to do with his spirituality, has everything to do with whether we have a peaceful society that allows us to have liberty. Liberty comes through the law. That's what we had in those 5 fundamental principles of the Declaration. That's the basis of the Constitution. The Founding Fathers came along with the Constitution and said, okay, we've set out the 5 principles. Now in the Constitution, we're going to put flesh on the skeleton. We're going to build this thing out. And so the Constitution did not change a single thing in the Declaration. It just built the structure around those 5 fundamental, unerring principles of American government that have made us the most successful nation in the history of the world.
Okay, David, how about some questions from the audience?
Sounds good.
All right, here we go.
Why do we need government?
Well, starting with the basics, I mean, really,
Yeah.
why is there a biblical reason for having government?
God who made us in the book of Genesis said there's 3 institutions I want you in relationship with. So right off the bat in the first 3 chapters, you got Adam, you got Eve, you got kids, the family. God said this is good. Next thing you come to in the middle part of Genesis is He says, all right, here's how I want you to conduct your horizontal relationship with each other. He specifically gave Noah a number of commands that, all right, if someone kills, here's what you do. That's horizontal relationship. That is government. This is the standards by which we live with one another, and that's why government's there, to enforce those standards about if someone murders, etc. So God ordains government as the second institution. The third institution, the latter part of Genesis, is the one that flows in a vertical direction. God says, here's how I want you to conduct your vertical relationship, and that is the church. As you get over in the New Testament in Romans 13, the Apostle Paul expounds on it even more, says that government exists to protect the righteous and to punish the wicked. That's why God gave them the sword. As a matter of fact, there's a great passage on government in 1 Timothy. Let me just read a few verses here. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, it says, we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, and knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless. So the first point is, God makes government not to regulate the good guys, but to regulate the bad guys, to protect the good guys from the bad guys. He said it's made for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for fornicators, for sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and anything else contrary to sound doctrine. And that's what we call the common law. The common law is what's been established for several hundred years as fundamental wrongs: robbery, arson, murder, theft, perjury, homosexuality, all these things that comes out of the Scriptures. And that's why government exists, is to say, hey, these are the wrong things to do. These are what destroy other people. This is what destroys a society. And so government is ordained by God. We need government.
So we don't want to be anti-government. We
That's
don't
right.
want to say, I don't want any government at all. There is a biblical reason for having government, and then government can be good
Now,
or bad
see,
depending on the principle.
It's the role of government, because if you take that standard that laws are made to regulate the bad guys, not the good guys, that's where people say, wait a minute, government's gone way across the line. In any given year in America, there's about 120,000 civil laws introduced every single year.
Wow.
There's a friend I have, she's now deceased, but she was 95 years old. Her name was Esther Armstrong. She loved doing prison ministry, and to the last of her life, she did prison ministry on a regular basis, and everybody loved her. And she's just a favorite grandmother. And she was in a prison one time with some of the guys, and one of the guys, we call a jailhouse attorney, he's in there so long, has a long enough sentence that he gets his law degree while he's in jail and then sues the jails. So he comes to her and he puts his arm around her and says, Mama Esther, he said, did you know there's more than 100,000 laws that'll put you in jail? And she looked back at him and said, do you know there's 10 laws that will keep you out of jail?
That's right.
And it's like, that's why God gave you the sword, is to punish the bad guys, to protect us. And that is a God-given, ordained role of government. So we need government because God who made us said, hey, you need to be able to have a horizontal relationship that is peaceful, that you protect your property, that you protect your rights, and that's why government exists.
All right, David, let's get another question on the foundations of American government.
Isn't the Constitution our founding document? Then why get so riled up about the Declaration of Independence?
Well, good question. We do spend a lot of time, obviously, on the Constitution,
Yeah.
but why also the Declaration of Independence?
Well, this is a change that's happened really in the last 50 years. In the last 50 years, as the courts have said, oh, you got to be more secular, you can't have religious expression in public, we've gotten into this thing of, oh, the Declaration is not important, the Constitution is. Now, why would we do that? Because the Declaration openly acknowledges God 4 times. And for 150 years, we consider that to be the founding document, not the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is what we swear to uphold, but interestingly, the Constitution, Article 7, called the Attestation Clause, directly ties itself to the Declaration. The Constitution dates itself back. As a matter of fact, every single presidential act signed by every president since George Washington right to the president is not dated to the Constitution, it's dated to the Declaration.
So you really cannot have one without the
You
other.
can't have one of the Founding Fathers looked at them as inseparable. Sam Adams signed the Declaration, he ratified the Constitution. He's one of the many who said you can't separate them. And it really is more like looking at it from a legal standpoint, that when you form a corporation, or form a nation in this case, but you form a business or corporation even today, you start with a legal document called the Articles of Incorporation. And that says, hey, here's why we're coming into existence, here's why we exist, here's what our purpose is. Then you come back with the second document called the Bylaws, and the bylaws say, now, we incorporate ourselves under the Articles of Incorporation, but here's the way we're going to run ourselves under these things over here.
Sort of like a mission statement and then
That's
the
it.
rules by
That's
which you're
it.
going to conduct
Because the
it.
bylaws are never allowed to violate the Articles of Incorporation. Here's why you exist, but here's how we do it under these rules. Well, that's what the Declaration and Constitution is. The Constitution are the bylaws. Here's how we're going to run things under this set of rules. It's significant that if you go back in history and look at old textbooks, here's one this is from Maine in 1820.
Wow.
Old textbook from Maine. This is a textbook that students had to take a written exam once a year for the first 8 years of school on this book. And this book has 4 documents in it. The 4 documents that students took a written exam on was number 1, the Declaration, number 2 was the Constitution, number 3 was George Washington's farewell address, and number 4 was the state constitution.
That was the foundation.
Those were the non-negotiables. You went over that every year in school. And so the Declaration is a key part of that. And to this day, if you look in the U.S. Code Annotated, which is the federal code under which we govern ourselves, on page 1 it has organic laws. And the organic laws are the foundational laws that no federal law, no state law is allowed to violate. And right up top is the Declaration of Independence. So that's one of those organic laws that no law can violate. And when we allow states to come into the United States, or territories to become states, we always require that they uphold the Declaration and the Constitution. Every state that came in after the Founding Fathers, you had to swear that our state government will uphold the Declaration and the Constitution. So while today we've been taught for 50 years in a much more secular society that the Constitution is it, but the Declaration has no relevance,
Yeah.
absolutely dead wrong. You can't understand the Constitution if you don't know the Declaration. And by the way, the 27 grievances that they gave you in the Declaration are all solved in the Constitution. So if you don't know what the grievances are, you don't know what the solution's all about.
You don't know why they did those things.
You don't know why they did. You won't even understand the Constitution if you separate it from the Declaration.
All right, Dave, got time for one more question on the foundations of American government.
Let's go for it.
The Constitution is a godless document. So how do you claim our nation was founded on godly principles?
I think we saved the best for last here. I hear this all the time.
Yeah.
It's a godless document. Is our Constitution
Well, in the
godless?
last 50 years, while they've tried to separate us from the Declaration because it's got so much God in it, they've come up with this notion, and this is the textbook that is used in universities across the country, written by a couple of professors at Cornell, PhDs, and that's what they claim. It's a godless Constitution. I mean, all the founding fathers were atheist, agnostics, deists, and they wouldn't give you something, which is nonsense. Out of the 56 signers of the Declaration, 29 held seminary degrees, so they're not atheist, agnostic, deists. A number of those who wrote the Constitution were absolute hardcore theologians who wrote doctrinal creeds for their denomination and their states. Their premise is wrong that godless guys wrote a godless document, but it's also easy to prove that they're wrong when you look at the document itself.
So it's not just that these were men of faith. Somehow the faith did make it into the document?
And political scientists have already documented. And as they went back and documented, they said, we think if we read the writings of the founding era and see who they quoted, we'll know where they got their sources. So it took them 10 years. They found 3,154 direct quotes in those writings. They took every quote back to its original source. Took them years to do it. Number one most quoted source was Charles Montesquieu, right over 8%. Number two was William Blackstone at 7.9%. Then you jump to John Locke at 2.9%. I mean, these are guys the Founding Fathers talked a lot about. They said they based the Declaration on Locke's work, separation of powers. They pointed to Montesquieu, the phrase in the Declaration, laws of nature, nature's God, came out of Blackstone. So, I mean, it's easy to document, but the one that had 34% of the quotes was the Bible. I mean, 4 times more than any other source.
And even the next largest source.
You go from 34% down to 8.2%. Now that's a big jump. The Bible's up here as the most frequently quoted source for the ideas, and then you jump down to folks like Montesquieu and Blackstone and Locke. So no question. And then when you start looking at specific clauses in the Constitution, if you look at the clauses, you look at Article 3, the clause that prohibits a bill of attainder. Where'd that come from? Read Ezekiel 18:20. And you look at Article 3, and there's a provision in Article 3 of the Constitution on witnesses. If you'll jump over to Deuteronomy 17, you'll see it word for word right there.
So you're saying not only were these guys men of faith, not only did this study show that they were quoting the Bible more than anyone else, but even the Bible itself made its way into the Constitution.
Oh yeah, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, they point to Jeremiah 17:9 as the basis of separation of powers, that novel thing that no other government had done. They point to the Bible on that. You have Article 4, which guarantees full republicanism in every government. That's why we elect our local, county, state, federal officials. The guys who wrote that pointed to Exodus 18:21 as a source of that.
So how do these guys then claim, where do they get their ideas if they're saying it's a godless document?
Good question. Where do they get their ideas? Let's go to the back of the book, go to the footnotes, see what sources, and you get to the back of the book.
This is where you get your evidence.
That's right.
This is where you show your evidence.
So here's the note on sources, and here's our 2 PhDs telling us, here's the basis of the fact that we can prove that this is a godless Constitution. We can prove that the guys who did this didn't believe in God. We can prove it, and here's our footnotes at the back, and they say, oh, interesting. They say, we have dispensed with the usual scholarly apparatus of footnotes. Now, wait a minute. The guys who wrote it said that it was not. Matter of fact, this right here, this is the Federalist Papers. This is considered the greatest commentary on the Constitution that exists. James Madison, in talking about the finished Constitution, says he believes it was written by the finger of God. Doesn't sound godless to me. Alexander Hamilton says the same thing. It was written by the finger of God.
But you're going all the way back to the guys that actually gave it to us. They're ignoring the history and just saying,
trust us.
trust
These guys are ignoring all the history. And
Yeah.
by the way, George Washington called the Constitution a miracle. He believed it was miraculous the way it was done. Benjamin Franklin, another guy who signed the Constitution, said he believed, and he quoted Acts 17:28 in his explanation, he believed that it had been overseen and guided and written by God. And he said, the same Spirit in whom we all live, move, and have our being. I mean, the guys who were there and saw it said, hey, this is a God deal. And now, 200 years later, PhDs tell us, oh no, it's a godless constitution. And the courts cite this and not this. But see, that's the thing for the last 50 years. The courts have been trying to move us in a more secular direction, so we can't afford to cite original documents because that would really show that it is not secular.
But if we want this, like you said, I mean, they came up with all these novel ideas. That produced the most successful
You betcha.
nation in history. If we want to hold on to that, we can't go to books like this. We got to go all the way
We
back.
actually need to know that, and we used to study that. This is a cool little book from 1828, and this little book is an elementary book, and it's called The Catechism on the Constitution. So you open this book up, and in elementary school, we were studying we study it in law school today. Do citizens,
elementary school, they're studying the Constitution.
Now, let me read you some elementary questions on the Constitution here, and these are all based on specific
I don't have to
clauses.
try to answer them, do I?
I don't know. You want to? Maybe I'll ask you this. Hey, Rick, here's some questions
This
for
isn't
you to
fair.
answer.
I'm being put on the spot.
You are
here.
being
Yeah.
put on the spot, but I will point out it's easy. It's elementary stuff.
Oh, great.
And,
Yeah.
and by the way, the Constitution, you and I have read it. It takes 20 minutes maybe. But here's some of the questions. May members of Congress be arrested while attending to their public duty? And the Constitution answers that, and the answer is no, except in 3 cases. The next question is, what are the 3 cases in which they may be arrested?
Elementary
Elementary.
kids are learning that kind of
I'll
not just
guarantee-
3 branches of government. They're getting down into
They're getting down into the
Wow.
specific details, and I'll guarantee you most attorneys, most Supreme Court bar attorneys could not
Right.
answer that little elementary question. Here's another one. May members of Congress be appointed to any civil office under the United States? Most members of Congress couldn't answer that.
Right.
See, these are all simple things in the Constitution. Nobody reads the Constitution anymore.
But
And we
this,
really
was,
need
this
to.
was very soon after the Constitution. Not very soon. I guess
Well,
50 years
it's
after
a
we're a
generation.
nation.
Yeah,
and
it's the kids of the guys who signed the document.
yeah.
I mean,
and they
but-
still understood you need to teach this
That's
every
right.
year.
Well,
you
John
know.
Jay, who one of the guys who did the Federalist Papers, he says every citizen should diligently read and study the Constitution of his country. They'll thereby know their rights and be better prepared to defend and assert them. It's like Jesus told us in Matthew 22:29. He said, "You guys err not knowing the Scriptures of the power of God." I mean, you religious guys, you don't even know the Scriptures. Well, we as citizens, if we don't know the Constitution, it's the same problem. Otherwise, you don't know your rights, you can't defend your rights, you can't assert your rights, and that's why we had every kid study it. And somehow we bought into this notion today that only the elites know the Constitution. Only the 9 guys on the Supreme Court can really tell us what it means. No. Elementary. It takes us 20 minutes to read it. We got to go back and get into that Constitution again. But having said that, it is not a godless document. No way, shape, fashion, or form. The guys who wrote it told us that. The Bible verses they used prove that. And the fact that it succeeded for so long, find me any other secular nation in the world that is successful. France is the leading secular nation. They've had 15 constitutions while we've had 1. Go to Poland. They've had 7 constitutions since 1921. Jump over to Russia, 4 constitutions since 1917. Hit Afghanistan, 5 constitutions since 1923. We've had 1. It works. It's not a godless document. No other secular nation or non-Christian nation in the world has had any success with their governments like we've had. It is because it's built on biblical principles.